She entered the wrong hotel room. The Millionaire CEO boss said, "Stay, I was waiting for you." A very beautiful, heartwarming and passionate love story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and comment, because it gives me confidence and gives me courage to write more powerful stories. Let's start with love. Some doors are meant to remain closed, and some mistakes are destined to become fate. But Fiona Miles would not understand this truth until she stepped through the wrong threshold and into the arms of a man who would destroy her world only to rebuild it more beautifully than before. The storm outside matched the tempest raging inside her chest. Rain assaulted the Imperial Grand Hotel with violent persistence, sheets of water transforming the city into a blurred watercolor painting viewed through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Fiona stood in the hallway on what she believed was the 12th floor, soaked through despite the umbrella that had turned inside out 3 blocks from the hotel entrance, her fingers fumbling with a keycard that refused to cooperate with the electronic lock. Everything about this evening had gone catastrophically wrong. The celebration dinner that was supposed to mark the culmination of her design career had instead marked its execution. Her partner, the woman she had trusted with every professional dream and financial decision, had systematically dismantled everything Fiona had spent years building. Client contracts mysteriously transferred to a new firm, bank accounts drained with forged signatures, a reputation built on integrity and vision, reduced to whispered accusations in design circles that moved like exclusive clubs, quick to exclude anyone touched by scandal. The keycard finally surrendered to her persistence, and the door opened. Warmth rushed out to greet her like an embrace from a lover she had not known she was missing. The suite glowed with amber light from a fireplace that crackled and popped, flames casting moving shadows across walls painted in soft cream. Rose petals traced a deliberate path across polished hardwood floors, leading toward a bedroom she could glimpse through a partially open door. Champagne waited in a silver bucket, the bottle sweating in the warm air, 2 crystal flutes positioned beside it with the precision of a carefully planned seduction. This was not her room. The realization came slowly, filtered through exhaustion that had seeped into her bones and made coherent thought feel like wading through deep water. She had booked something modest, affordable given her suddenly precarious financial situation. This suite belonged to someone expecting romance, celebration, a night of significance. She should have turned around immediately, should have closed the door and found the front desk, explained the confusion, located her actual room. But her legs had carried her as far as they were willing to go, and the sofa near the fireplace looked impossibly inviting. Just a moment, she told herself. Just long enough to gather strength for one more navigation of hallways and explanations, and the logistics of a life that had become unmanageable. Fiona collapsed onto the sofa, and the tears she had been holding back since the dinner finally broke free. They came in waves that shook her shoulders and made breathing difficult, years of careful control dissolving in the safety of a room that was not hers, but felt like sanctuary. She cried for the career that lay in ruins, for the trust that had been shattered, for the version of herself that had walked into that restaurant, believing the world was fundamentally fair to those who worked hard and loved what they did. "I thought you changed your mind." This voice came from across the room, masculine and rough, with an emotion she could not immediately identify. Fiona's head jerked up, her heart slamming against her ribs with the force of surprised fear. A man stood near the windows, his silhouette backlit by the city lights beyond the glass, his posture radiating tension and something darker, something that felt like resignation mixed with pain. He stepped forward into the firelight, and Fiona saw his face clearly for the first time. He was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, all sharp angles and intense grey eyes that seemed to see through her skin directly into the broken places she tried to hide. His dark hair was disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, tie discarded somewhere. sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of strength held carefully in check. "I'm sorry," Fiona managed, her voice wrecked from crying. "The keycard worked, and I didn't realize this wasn't my room." He studied her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like relief, as though her accidental presence had answered a question he had been asking himself. "You're crying," he said simply, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Whatever brought you to the wrong room must have been significant." Something about his tone, the gentleness in his words, despite the obvious pain in his eyes, broke down the last of her defenses. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the anonymity of a stranger who knew nothing about her professional disgrace, or simply the kindness in his voice when she had expected anger at her intrusion. Whatever the reason, Fiona found herself talking. She told him about the partnership that had ended in betrayal, about walking into the restaurant expecting celebration and walking out with nothing but the knowledge that someone she loved had systematically stolen her life's work. She spoke about the clients who would not return her calls now, the whispers that followed her through galleries and design shows, the way her own certainty about her judgment had been shaken so profoundly she no longer trusted her ability to read people or situations. He listened without interrupting, his focus absolute, and when she finally ran out of words, he moved to the champagne bucket and poured 2 glasses. He handed her one and sat down in the chair across from her, maintaining that careful distance that felt respectful rather than cold. "I arranged all of this." He gestured to the roses, the fireplace, the champagne, for someone who sent me a message an hour ago saying she had made a final decision about us. And that decision was to end what we had tried to rebuild. His voice carried its own devastation, and Fiona understood that she had stumbled into someone else's destroyed evening, someone else's carefully constructed hope that had crumbled into dust. They sat in the warm light of the fireplace, 2 strangers united by the specific pain of betrayal. And somehow the silence between them felt more intimate than conversations she had shared with people she had known for years. "I'm Steve," he said finally, raising his glass slightly. "Fiona," she replied, meeting his gesture with her own. They talked through the night, sharing wounds with the brutal honesty that only strangers in the dark can offer each other. He told her about building something from nothing, about pouring everything into creating stability and security, only to realize that success could not fill the hollow spaces where connection should live. She spoke about the difference between designing beautiful spaces for others and never quite feeling at home in her own life, about the ways she had mistaken professional partnership for genuine friendship and paid the price for that confusion. Hours dissolved into moments. The champagne bottle emptied. The fire burned low and then rebuilt itself when Steve added more wood with practiced efficiency. Fiona found herself laughing at stories he told about his childhood, about a mother who raised him alone and taught him that strength came in many forms, not all of them loud. He listened to her describe the joy of transforming empty rooms into homes, the almost spiritual satisfaction of understanding what people needed their spaces to say about them even when they could not articulate it themselves. The attraction between them had been present from the first moment, but grew with each shared story, each laugh, each comfortable silence. It was not just physical, though the awareness of his body and the way his eyes lingered on her face made her skin feel warm. It was deeper, more dangerous. It was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the world was not always kind to people who loved deeply and trusted easily. When he reached for her hand, the touch sent electricity through her entire body. When he leaned closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away, she closed the distance between them instead. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question asked and answered. Then it deepened into something urgent and necessary. as though they were both trying to forget their pain by losing themselves in sensation and connection. "Stay," he whispered against her lips, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I was waiting for you." She knew he meant the other woman, the one who had ended things, but in that moment it felt like a larger truth, as though every choice she had ever made, every wrong turn and disappointment, had been leading her to this room, this man, this night of healing wrapped in passion that burned away everything except the feeling of being wanted, being seen, being held by someone who understood that broken things could still be beautiful. They made love through the remainder of the night, learning each other's bodies with attention and care, and when dawn began painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Fiona knew she was leaving behind more than just a hotel room. She was leaving behind pieces of her heart with a man whose last name she did not know, whose life intersected with hers for one perfect, impossible night. She dressed quietly while he slept, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. She did not leave a note because there were no words adequate to capture what had passed between them. And she did not wake him because she feared that daylight would reveal the magic of the night to be nothing but illusion. Fiona slipped out of the room as silently as she had entered it, and she did not look back, because if she had, she might never have found the strength to leave. What she did not know, could not know, as she stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, was that she carried with her more than just memories of a night that would haunt her forever. She carried the beginning of a future that would test her in ways she could not imagine, break her heart more completely than betrayal ever had, and ultimately give her everything she had ever wanted, wrapped in a form she never expected. Behind her, Steve woke to an empty room and a cold fireplace, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had just let the most important person in his life walk away without even knowing her last name. Chapter 2: The Foundations of New Beginnings. 3 months later, Fiona sat in a clinic bathroom staring at 3 positive pregnancy tests arranged in a row on the sink, like evidence in a trial where she was both defendant and judge, and understood that the universe had a sense of humor darker than she had ever imagined possible. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the small space with a brightness that made her want to close her eyes and pretend this was someone else's reality. Her hands shook as she picked up the first test, then the second, then the third, as though examining them more closely would somehow change the results that blazed pink and undeniable. Pregnant. The word echoed through her consciousness like a bell that would never stop ringing. She pressed her hands against her still flat stomach and tried to understand how one night, one perfect and terrible night, with a man whose last name she had never learned, could have created a life growing inside her body with the quiet persistence of a miracle or a disaster, depending on which moment of the day she was experiencing. She had searched for him. In the days after leaving the hotel, while her body still hummed with the memory of his touch and her heart ached with the loss of something that had barely begun, she had returned to the Imperial Grand Hotel. The staff, polite but firm, explained that they could not share guest information. She had no last name to give them, no room number beyond a floor. She now realized she had misremembered. Nothing except a first name that was common enough to be useless. Steve. Somewhere in this vast city lived a man named Steve who had held her through the darkness, who had listened to her pain and shared his own, who had touched her with a combination of tenderness and passion that had rewired something fundamental in her understanding of what intimacy could feel like. And she had no way to find him. No method of telling him that their night together had created consequences neither of them could have anticipated. The ultrasound appointment came 2 weeks after the positive tests. Fiona lay on the examination table with cold gel spread across her abdomen, watching the technician's face as the wand moved across her skin. She expected to see one flickering heartbeat, one small proof of life. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat and her eyes fill with tears that were equal parts joy and terror. 3 heartbeats. 3 small flickering lights on the screen that pulsed with determination and life. The technician turned to her with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring, but instead felt overwhelming. "Congratulations," the woman said warmly. "You're having triplets." Triplets. The word felt impossible, like something that happened to other people in stories she read or movies she watched, not something that happened to women whose lives had already been shattered once and were now being reconstructed from fragments and hope. Triplets meant 3 babies to feed, to clothe, to raise. Triplets meant her modest savings would evaporate even faster than she had calculated. Triplets meant she would be raising 3 children alone because their father existed somewhere beyond her reach, living his life without knowledge of the 3 lives he had helped create. The decision to keep them came without hesitation, arriving fully formed in her heart before her brain had time to catalogue all the logical reasons why single motherhood of triplets was an impossibility wrapped in foolishness. These babies were hers. They were part of her, and they were part of him, that stranger who had held her so carefully and kissed her like she was something precious instead of something broken. She would find a way because there was no other option that her soul would allow her to consider. Fiona moved to a different neighborhood, packing her belongings into boxes and saying goodbye to the apartment where she had imagined building her career and her future. The new place was smaller, located in a community where people worked multiple jobs and raised their children with the fierce determination of those who understood that life was not fair but could still be good if you fought hard enough. Her neighbors were nothing like the professional contacts she had cultivated in her previous life. Elderly women who sat on their porches and called out greetings in the evening. Young mothers who juggled babies and work schedules with the coordination of circus performers. Immigrant families whose resilience and optimism in the face of challenges that would have crushed her made her ashamed of her own self-pity during difficult moments. She started taking design work wherever she could find it. Small projects for people who could not afford the luxury firms that once competed for her attention. A grandmother who wanted help making a tiny apartment feel like home for the grandchildren she was raising. A family who needed to fit 7 people into a space designed for 3. A veteran who wanted his walls painted in colors that reminded him of peace instead of war. This work was different from what she had done before. There were no magazine features or industry awards. No one took photographs of her designs to publish in glossy spreads about emerging talent. But there was something more valuable growing in the space where her ego had once lived. Her clients trusted her with their dreams, invited her into their homes and their lives, and thanked her with tears in their eyes when she transformed their cramped spaces into havens of beauty and function. She found purpose in this new work, discovered that creating beauty for people who genuinely needed it fed something in her soul that designing showpiece penthouses for wealthy clients never had. Each project was a reminder that she could still build something meaningful from the wreckage of her former life, that her skills had value even in this neighborhood where people measured wealth in different currencies than what her previous world had recognized. As her belly swelled with new life, growing rounder with each passing week until she moved through the world carrying her pregnancy before her like a declaration, she felt herself being rebuilt by the very people she was helping. Her neighbors checked on her constantly, bringing food they could barely afford to share, offering advice about pregnancy and childbirth and raising children without partners. They created a community around her that felt more solid than any professional network she had ever cultivated, because this community was built on genuine care rather than strategic networking. the elderly woman next door, whose name was Pearl, and whose face held the kind of beauty that comes from living fully and surviving completely, became her confidant and surrogate mother. Pearl had raised her own children alone after her husband died young, and she shared wisdom earned through decades of making impossible situations work through sheer determination and faith. "Those babies are blessings," Pearl told her one evening. As they sat on the small balcony Fiona had transformed with hanging plants and second-hand furniture. "Don't matter how they came to be or where their daddy is, they're yours, and they're going to teach you things about love you never knew you needed to learn." Fiona rested her hands on her belly, feeling the movement of 3 lives that seemed determined to remind her constantly of their presence, kicking and shifting as though already competing for space and attention. She thought about Steve often, wondered what he was doing, whether he ever thought about the woman who had stumbled into his hotel room and then vanished like smoke. She imagined telling him about the babies, pictured his reaction in 1,000 different variations that ranged from joy to rejection, and ultimately decided that her imagination was a poor substitute for reality, but safer than the risk of discovering he wanted nothing to do with the complications she would bring into his life. She would tell her children about their father, she promised herself. When they were old enough to ask, she would describe him honestly. A good man who had shown her kindness during one of the darkest nights of her life. A stranger who had held her gently and made her feel less alone in her pain. She would not paint him as a villain or a saint, just as a man she had known briefly and completely, whose name she would give to their children, even though she could not give them his presence. The night she went into labor arrived like a storm after a long drought, sudden and overwhelming and unstoppable. Pearl drove her to the hospital, holding her hand during contractions that felt like her body was being torn apart and rebuilt simultaneously, staying with her through hours of pain that transcended anything she had imagined, even in her most anxious moments. When her children finally entered the world, tiny and perfect and screaming with the outrage of those suddenly thrust into cold air and bright lights, Fiona understood that everything she had lost, every betrayal she had survived, every moment of pain and fear had been necessary to bring her to this moment. These 3 small humans were worth every hardship, every sacrifice, every sleepless night that stretched ahead into a future she could not predict but no longer feared because they would be in it. She named them with intention and love. Jasper Hughes, Laurel Hughes and Sienna Hughes. She gave them his last name because even though she could not find their father, could not tell him he had become a parent, these children deserved to carry his legacy as part of their identity. Jasper had his father's eyes, grey and intense even in infancy. Laurel had a smile that transformed her entire face into sunshine. Sienna possessed a quietness that felt like wisdom, watching the world with an attention that seemed impossible in someone so new to existence. The months that followed were the hardest of Fiona's life. She functioned on fragments of sleep that never felt adequate, learning to feed 3 babies on a rotating schedule that consumed all available hours. Her body ached constantly from carrying infants who seemed to take turns, deciding they needed to be held. Her finances became an elaborate juggling act, where she moved money between accounts and prayed nothing unexpected would push her into a crisis she could not solve. But through the exhaustion and the fear and the moments when she cried in the bathroom because she did not know how she would survive another day, there was joy. Profound, world-altering joy in the weight of her babies in her arms, in their first smiles, in the way they reached for her when they were frightened or hungry or simply wanted the comfort of their mother's presence. Pearl and the neighbors created a support system that kept her afloat. They brought meals and took shifts holding babies so Fiona could shower or sleep or simply sit in silence for 5 minutes. They celebrated every milestone as though Jasper, Laurel and Sienna belonged to the entire community, which in a sense they did. Fiona rebuilt her life around her children, and in doing so, she built something stronger and more meaningful than what had been destroyed. She took design projects during nap times, conducted client consultations with babies balanced on her hip, and discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. At night, when the house was finally quiet and her children slept in their cribs, Fiona sometimes allowed herself to remember that night at the hotel. She thought about Steve, wondered if he had found happiness with someone else, hoped that wherever he was, he had healed from whatever pain had brought him to that room alone. She did not regret their night together, could not regret something that had given her Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna. But she also did not seek him out. Pride and fear kept her rooted in her new life, convinced that disrupting his world with news of children he never asked for would be cruel rather than kind. She told herself she was protecting him from unwanted responsibility, but deep down, she knew she was protecting herself and her babies from the possibility of rejection that would hurt far worse than his absence. What she did not know, could not know, as she rocked Sienna back to sleep in the quiet hours before dawn, was that across the city, Steve Hughes lay awake in his own bed, thinking about a woman named Fiona, whose last name he had never learned, whose memory had become the measure against which he judged every other connection in his life, and found them all desperately wanting. Chapter 3. The Birth of Miracles. Winter arrived early, blanketing the city in snow that transformed familiar streets into landscapes from fairy tales, and Fiona celebrated her children's 5th birthday by understanding that she had somehow survived what should have been impossible and emerged stronger than she had ever been before. The community center was decorated with balloons and streamers in primary colors that Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna had chosen with the fierce conviction that only children possess about matters of aesthetic importance. Tables were covered with food that neighbors had contributed, each dish representing someone's love and investment in these 3 children who belonged to Fiona but felt beloved by everyone in the neighborhood. Fiona stood near the window watching her children play with other kids, their laughter creating a soundtrack of joy that filled the space like music. Jasper was explaining something with serious intensity to a group of older children who listened with surprising patience. Laurel was dancing spontaneously, her movements unself-conscious and full of the kind of freedom that comes before the world teaches people to be aware of themselves. Sienna sat slightly apart, engaged in quiet conversation with Pearl, the two of them sharing the comfortable silence of people who understood that stillness could be its own form of communication. These 5 years had transformed Fiona in ways she was still discovering. The woman who had walked out of that hotel room carrying secret life inside her body no longer existed. In her place stood someone tougher, wiser, more capable of weathering storms, because she had learned that survival was not about avoiding hardship, but about finding strength in the middle of it. Her design work had grown through recommendations and word of mouth until she had more projects than she could reasonably manage. She still worked with modest budgets and clients who could not afford luxury, but the work filled her with satisfaction that her previous career never had. She was not designing showpieces to be photographed and admired. She was creating homes where families built memories, where children grew up feeling safe, where people who worked hard could come back to spaces that honored their labor with beauty and comfort. The money remained tight. There were months when she juggled bills with the precision of someone performing surgery, deciding which payments could be delayed and which ones would result in consequences she could not afford. But they always had enough. Food on the table, clothes that fit well enough even if they came from second-hand stores, and most importantly, a home filled with love that felt more valuable than anything money could purchase. Jasper had inherited his father's intensity and intelligence. He asked questions that made Fiona pause and think carefully about her answers, challenging assumptions with logic that seemed advanced beyond his years. He was protective of his sisters, positioning himself between them and anything he perceived as threat with a fierceness that both worried and warmed her. Laurel was pure joy wrapped in human form. She made friends instantly, saw beauty in everything, and approached the world with optimism that Fiona sometimes envied. She danced through life literally, moving to music only she could hear, and her smile could transform the mood of any room she entered. Sienna was the quiet observer, the one who watched and understood before speaking. She had wisdom in her eyes that felt borrowed from someone who had lived many lifetimes. She noticed things others missed, and her insights sometimes startled Fiona with their depth and accuracy. Fiona told them stories about their father, carefully crafted narratives that painted him as someone honorable and kind. She described the night they met without revealing the full circumstances, explaining that sometimes people come into your life briefly but change everything, that their father was a good man whose circumstances had separated from them. She showed them his last name, which they carried, and explained that even though he was not present, he was part of them in ways that mattered. Jasper asked the hardest questions. Why doesn't he visit us? Doesn't he want to know us? His grey eyes, so like his father's, demanded honesty that Fiona struggled to provide without revealing her own uncertainties and fears. Sometimes life is complicated, she told him, hating the inadequacy of her answer, but unable to offer better truth. Your father doesn't know about you because I could not find him to tell him. If he knew, I believe he would want to be here. She believed it. Had to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that she had spent one night with someone capable of walking away from his children without looking back. And she could not reconcile that possibility with her memories of his gentleness and care. Pearl watched Fiona's struggles with the compassionate eyes of someone who had navigated her own impossible situations. "You're going to have to find that man someday," she said one evening after the children were asleep. "Those babies deserve to know their daddy, and he deserves to know he has children. Secrets like this don't stay buried forever." "I don't even know how to look for him anymore," Fiona admitted. "I tried in the beginning. The hotel wouldn't give me information. I had nothing but a first name. The city is huge, and he could be anywhere, living any kind of life." "The universe has a way of bringing people together when they're meant to find each other," Pearl said, with the certainty of someone whose faith had been tested and proven. "You focus on raising those beautiful babies, and when the time is right, their daddy will come back into the picture." Fiona wanted to believe her, but feared the reunion Pearl predicted with equal measure. What if Steve had moved on completely, married someone else, built a family that had no room for surprise children from a one-night encounter he barely remembered? What if he looked at Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna and felt nothing but resentment for the complications they represented? What if their existence disrupted his life in ways that made him angry rather than grateful? The party wound down as the afternoon light faded into evening. Children were collected by parents, leftover food was packed into containers, and balloons were distributed to excited recipients who clutched them like prizes. Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna helped clean up with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from being raised in a home where everyone contributed because there was no other option. That night, after stories were read and teeth were brushed, and 3 children were finally tucked into their beds, Fiona sat alone in her small living room and allowed herself to think about Steve. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if that night had meant anything beyond temporary comfort for both of them. She hoped he was happy wherever he was, whatever his life looked like now. What she did not know was that Steve Hughes spent that same evening alone in a residence that felt increasingly empty despite being filled with expensive furniture and artwork. He had built his empire higher, expanded his holdings, achieved success that should have felt satisfying, but instead felt hollow. He dated women who looked perfect beside him at events and charity functions, but none of them penetrated the walls he had constructed around his heart after Fiona disappeared. He still thought about her constantly. Her face appeared in his dreams with such clarity that he sometimes woke reaching for someone who was not there. He had searched for her with increasing desperation in the months after their night together, hiring people to investigate, checking hotel records, following every possible lead, until they all dead-ended in frustration. A woman named Fiona, who had been a designer, who had stumbled into his room by mistake, who had held him through the darkness and then vanished like smoke. He never stopped looking, not really. Even as years passed and the likelihood of finding her decreased, even as he told himself to move forward and forget someone he had known for one night. Part of him remained frozen in that moment when he woke to an empty room and realized he had let the most important person in his life walk away. In separate parts of the city, Fiona and Steve existed in parallel worlds that should never intersect again. She raised 3 children who carried his name and his features, building a life from determination and love. He built an empire while searching for a woman whose last name he had never learned, convinced that she held the key to filling the empty spaces in his chest. Neither of them knew that fate was already preparing their collision, arranging circumstances that would bring them back together in ways they could not predict or prevent, setting the stage for a reunion that would be beautiful and terrible and inevitable, like watching a storm approach across an open plain, with nowhere left to run and no desire to hide. Chapter 4. The Collision of Worlds. The announcement appeared in newspapers and community bulletins with the clinical efficiency of words designed to obscure their devastating impact. Hughes Continental Holdings proposed comprehensive redevelopment of affordable housing units in the neighborhood Fiona had called home, and watching those plans unfold felt like being betrayed for the second time in her life by forces she could not control. The community center buzzed with angry voices and frightened questions on the evening of the first informational meeting. Families who had lived in the neighborhood their entire lives sat in folding chairs, listening to corporate representatives explain how progress required displacement, how their homes would be transformed into luxury residences, how they would receive relocation assistance that everyone knew was inadequate compensation for losing the communities they had built through decades of shared experience. Fiona stood in the back of the room, feeling rage build in her chest like a living thing demanding release. These were her neighbors, her extended family, the people who had helped her survive the impossible years of raising triplets alone, the community that had transformed her from a broken woman into someone strong enough to face any challenge. And now, some corporation wanted to erase all of it, replace human connection with profit margins and luxury amenities that would serve people who had never needed community because they had always been able to purchase whatever they required. She spoke without planning to, standing up and interrupting the presentation with a voice that shook with emotion but did not break. She talked about the families who would be scattered, the elderly residents who would not survive displacement from the only homes they knew, the children who would lose the stability of familiar schools and friendships. She proposed alternative models that incorporated affordable housing alongside new development, hybrid approaches that honored existing communities while allowing growth. Her words resonated through the room, the voices joining hers until the corporate representatives faced a wall of opposition they clearly had not anticipated. The meeting ended in chaos and commitment, neighbors organizing resistance and appointing Fiona as their spokesperson, because her design background gave her credibility and her passion gave her power. The battle consumed the following months. Fiona attended city council meetings, organized protests, coordinated with legal advocates who volunteered their time to fight for communities that could not afford expensive attorneys. She appeared in local news coverage, her face and voice becoming synonymous with grassroots resistance against corporate development that prioritized profit over people. She was exhausted constantly, balancing her design work and raising 3 children with the demands of activism that seemed to expand daily. Pearl watched the triplets during evening meetings, and her neighbors contributed what they could to keep Fiona's household functioning while she fought for all of them. Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna understood that their mother was engaged in something important, and they tried to be helpful in the ways children can be, requiring less attention and creating fewer problems than they might have otherwise. Steve Hughes learned about the opposition leader through reports from his development team. They showed him news clips and articles featuring a woman named Fiona Miles, who combined fierce intelligence with genuine compassion, who spoke about community and responsibility with conviction that was making his project significantly more complicated than he had anticipated. He watched the videos in his office, and his world stopped rotating on its axis. Fiona. His Fiona, the woman from the hotel. Older now, her face marked by years and responsibility, but unmistakably her. The same eyes that had looked at him with devastation and vulnerability. The same voice that had shared her pain through the darkness. The same woman who had disappeared from his life and left a hole nothing else had been able to fill. His hands shook as he replayed the footage, memorizing details he had thought were lost to memory and time. She had a last name now. She lived in the neighborhood his company wanted to redevelop. She was fighting against his plans with everything she had, positioning herself as the voice of opposition to his vision. He demanded a meeting with her immediately, ignoring advice from his team, who warned that direct engagement with community activists could be strategically dangerous. He did not care about strategy or optics or anything except seeing her again, understanding why she had disappeared, discovering if the connection between them had been real or merely a fantasy he had nurtured in lonely moments when his life felt particularly empty. The meeting was arranged in a conference room that felt sterile and wrong for the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Fiona arrived with her presentation materials, prepared to fight for her community with every argument she had refined through countless meetings and sleepless nights spent crafting proposals. She walked through the door, and then she saw him, Steve Hughes, the CEO behind the development project. The name she had given to her children, the man who had held her through one perfect night and then existed only in memories and stories she told to 3 children who carried his features. The recognition hit them simultaneously, a physical force that stole breath and rational thought. Fiona's presentation materials slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the conference table. Steve stood frozen, staring at her with eyes that held shock and something deeper, something that looked like desperate relief mixed with confusion. "You," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Where did you go?" The question hung between them, loaded with accusation and pain, and 5 years of unanswered searching. Fiona could not speak, her mind racing through implications that threatened to drown her. He was the CEO. He had been looking for her. He did not know about their children. Everything she had built, every story she had told herself about why finding him was impossible, suddenly revealed itself as carefully constructed denial. "Why did you leave?" he demanded, moving around the table toward her. "I searched for you. I hired people to find you. I went back to the hotel dozens of times hoping you would appear again. You vanished like you were never real. You looked for me." Her voice came out broken, disbelieving. "You hired investigators. You have resources I could never dream of, and you could not find me. You never told me your last name," he said, his frustration evident in every word. "You gave me nothing but Fiona and one night, and then you disappeared. How was I supposed to find you with that?" The professional meeting dissolved completely. They stood in the conference room having a conversation that had nothing to do with development projects and everything to do with 5 years of missed connection and accumulated longing. His team excused themselves quietly, recognizing that whatever was happening was far beyond their ability to mediate or control. Fiona's mind raced with calculations about revelation and risk. She should tell him about Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna immediately. But fear paralyzed her capacity for honesty. What if he tried to take them from her? His wealth gave him advantages she could not match. His legal resources could bury her in court battles she had no capacity to fight. "I need to leave," she said abruptly, gathering her scattered papers with trembling hands. This was a mistake. "Don't," Steve said, his hand catching her wrist gently, his touch sending electricity through her entire body. "Please don't run again. I've spent 5 years trying to find you, and you're here, and I need to understand what happened." She pulled away from his touch, because remaining in physical contact would destroy what remained of her composure. "You want to understand? You want to tear apart my neighborhood, displace families who have nowhere else to go, and you expect me to explain myself to you." "I don't want to tear anything apart," he said, his voice shifting from personal to professional, clearly trying to regain some control over a conversation that had spiraled into territory neither of them knew how to navigate. "I want to develop the area, create opportunities, improve infrastructure." "By destroying what already exists," she countered, her anger rising to match her fear. "You see buildings that need replacing. I see homes where people have raised families, where communities have been built through decades of shared experience. You want to erase all of that for luxury condominiums that will serve people who don't need community because they can purchase whatever they require." They argued about the development project, their words heated but their attention divided, both of them trying to have a professional conversation while drowning in the personal history that charged every syllable with additional meaning. The meeting ended without resolution, Fiona fleeing the conference room like it was on fire, Steve staring after her with an expression that combined longing and frustration and determination. She did not tell him about their children. The opportunity passed unmarked, and with each moment that followed, the secret grew heavier and more impossible to reveal. She told herself she needed time, needed to understand his intentions, needed to protect Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna from potential rejection or custody battles that could tear them from the only parent they had ever known. But underneath the justifications, she knew the truth. She was afraid, terrified of his reaction, of his power, of the ways he could disrupt everything she had built if he chose to exercise his rights as a father who had been kept ignorant of his children's existence. That night, Fiona lay awake staring at her ceiling while her children slept in the next room, and she understood that she had just made a terrible mistake that would have consequences she could not predict but would certainly devastate the fragile peace she had constructed from the wreckage of her previous life. Chapter 5: Secrets. And growing attraction. Steve became relentless in his pursuit, but his methods were catastrophically wrong. Each gesture intended to demonstrate interest, only deepening Fiona's fury and confirming her decision to keep their children's secret, until she could understand his character beyond the ruthless CEO who thought money could solve every problem. The first offer arrived via courier, a legal document proposing financial compensation in exchange for her withdrawal from community organizing. The amount was substantial, enough to secure her future and her children's education, presented in language that made it sound like generosity rather than what it actually was, an attempt to purchase her silence and cooperation. Fiona tore the document in half and sent the pieces back with a note that said simply, "I'm not for sale." More offers followed, donations to the community center in her name, scholarships for neighborhood children, grants for small businesses, each gesture designed to demonstrate his resources and his willingness to invest in the community. each one missing the fundamental point that people could not be bought or relocated or convinced to abandon their homes through financial incentives alone. She rejected every offer with increasing vehemence, and their public battle became the talk of the city. Media outlets loved the narrative. Millionaire CEO versus passionate community advocate, money versus principle, progress versus preservation. What they did not see were the private moments when Steve showed up at community meetings, ostensibly to negotiate, but really just to be in the same room with her. When their eyes met across crowded spaces and the air became electric with unspoken history, Fiona found herself watching for him despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. He attended meetings he had no need to personally oversee, sitting in the back of community center gatherings and listening to residents share their fears about displacement. She saw him taking notes, not with the detachment of someone collecting data, but with the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand perspectives different from his own. The project proposals began changing. Subtle shifts at first, then more dramatic revisions that incorporated elements of the hybrid model Fiona had proposed. His team resisted, arguing that affordable housing requirements would reduce profitability. But Steve pushed back with determination that surprised his own people. He started appearing in the neighborhood outside of formal meetings. Fiona saw him at the community center renovation, rolling up his sleeves and working alongside residents to repair damaged walls and install new fixtures. He was awkward with physical labor, clearly more accustomed to boardrooms than construction sites. But he kept showing up, kept trying, kept demonstrating through action that he was willing to learn what this community valued. Pearl noticed his presence with the knowing smile of someone who had seen many romances bloom through resistance and denial. "That man is working hard to prove something to you," she observed one evening as they watched Steve help paint a mural designed by neighborhood children. "He's trying to manipulate me," Fiona said, but her conviction sounded weak even to her own ears. "He's trying to win your respect," Pearl corrected. "There's a difference. You might consider giving him a chance to show you who he actually is, instead of who you've decided he must be." Fiona knew Pearl was right, but admitting it felt dangerous. Every time Steve demonstrated kindness or genuine care for the community, the secret of their children pressed more heavily on her conscience. She watched him interact with kids at the community center, saw how Jasper gravitated toward him during one event, drawn to this man who had his eyes without knowing they shared blood. Steve established a scholarship fund for local students without making any public announcement. The donation discovered only when administrators started processing applications. He hired contractors from the neighborhood for preliminary work on the revised development plans, paying wages above standard rates. He attended a resident's funeral because he had met the woman once at a community meeting and remembered her name and her concerns about being relocated from the home where she had raised her children. These quiet gestures chipped away at Fiona's defenses, revealing a man who was more than just a wealthy CEO interested in profit margins. She saw glimpses of the person she had met that night in the hotel, the one who had listened to her pain with genuine compassion, who had held her with tender ferocity, who had made her feel less alone in her devastation. The tension between them grew with each encounter, professional conversations charged with personal awareness that neither acknowledged directly. They argued about zoning requirements and affordable housing percentages, while their bodies leaned toward each other with magnetic inevitability. They debated construction timelines and community benefits while their eyes held contact longer than necessary, communicating things their words carefully avoided. Fiona found herself thinking about him constantly, remembering the way his hands had felt against her skin, the sound of his voice in the darkness, the safety she had felt in his arms. She wanted to hate him for complicating her life, for being the obstacle she had to overcome to protect her community. But desire kept interfering with her anger. making her hyper-aware of his presence in ways that felt dangerous and irresistible. Steve was equally consumed. He attended meetings he could have delegated, stayed late at community events he had no professional reason to attend, and found excuses to speak with Fiona about matters that could have been handled through email or intermediaries. He studied her when she was not looking, memorizing new details to add to memories that had sustained him through 5 years of searching. The breakthrough came during a late-night planning session at the community center. Most residents had left, and Fiona remained with Steve, reviewing architectural drawings for the revised development. They stood close together at a table covered with blueprints, and the familiar scent of his cologne transported her instantly back to that night in the hotel. "Why did you search for me?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because that night was the most real thing I had experienced in years. Because you made me feel understood in ways I didn't know I needed. Because I woke up alone and realized I had just let the most important person in my life walk away without even knowing her last name." His honesty stripped away her defenses, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. "You had a whole life," she said quietly. "A woman you were trying to reconcile with. I was just—" "You were never just anything," he interrupted, his hand reaching up to cup her face with the same gentleness she remembered. "That night changed me. Every woman I've dated since then has been measured against you, and none of them came close to what I felt during those hours we spent together." She should have stepped back, should have maintained professional boundaries, should have told him about their children before this moment progressed any further. But his touch erased her capacity for rational thought, and when he leaned closer, she closed the distance between them without hesitation. The kiss was everything she remembered and more. 5 years of longing condensed into contact that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and she melted into him with a sound that was part relief and part surrender. They broke apart, breathing hard, staring at each other with eyes that reflected mutual shock at the intensity of what still existed between them. Neither spoke, the silence heavy with implications neither was ready to address. Fiona fled moments later, grabbing her things and leaving the community center like it was burning down around her. She drove home with shaking hands, parked in her driveway, and sat in the darkness, understanding that she had just made everything infinitely more complicated. Inside her house, 3 children slept peacefully, unaware that their mother had just kissed their father without telling him he had children, without revealing the truth that grew more impossible to share with each passing moment of continued deception. Chapter 6. The First Twist, when truth fractures everything. The revelation came during a community celebration that should have marked victory, the afternoon when approval for the revised development project transformed into the moment when carefully constructed secrets exploded into devastating truth that left everyone wounded and nothing the same. The park was filled with neighbors who had fought together for months, children playing on equipment that would not be demolished, elderly residents sitting on benches they would not be forced to abandon. Food trucks donated free meals, and live music created a festive atmosphere that felt earned through collective effort and refusal to accept defeat without fighting back. Fiona moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and thanks, her heart lighter than it had been in months. They had won something significant, a revised development plan that preserved affordable housing alongside new construction, a model that could serve as precedent for other communities facing similar displacement. Steve had been instrumental in achieving this compromise, fighting his own board and investors to create something that prioritized people over maximum profit. She saw him across the park, talking with Pearl and other residents, and her heart did that familiar flip that happened whenever he was near. They had been carefully navigating their attraction since the kiss at the community center, maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging through glances and stolen moments that something powerful existed between them. Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna were playing nearby, their laughter carrying across the park. Fiona watched them with the contentment of a mother whose children are happy and safe, her attention divided between the celebration and ensuring her triplets did not wander too far. Steve was moving through the crowd in her general direction, stopping to speak with residents when he encountered the play area where children had gathered around a face-painting station. He paused to watch them, a smile softening his features in ways that made him look younger and less guarded. Jasper approached him directly, with the confidence of a child who has not yet learned that adults can be intimidating. "You helped my mom," he said, looking up at Steve with those striking grey eyes that were identical to Steve's own. Steve looked down at the boy, and Fiona saw the exact moment when curiosity shifted into suspicion and then into dawning realization. Steve crouched to Jasper's level, studying his face with an intensity that made other adults step back slightly, sensing something significant unfolding. "What's your name?" Steve asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Jasper Hughes," the boy answered proudly. "That's my sister Laurel, and that's my other sister Sienna. We're triplets." Steve's face drained of color. His eyes moved from Jasper to Laurel to Sienna, calculating ages, recognizing his own features reflected in 3 small faces. Gray eyes that were rare and unmistakable. The shape of Laurel's smile. The way Sienna held her head when listening carefully. His expression shifted from shock to understanding to something that looked like grief mixed with rage. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Fiona. She was already moving toward him, having seen the encounter, knowing with sinking certainty that her secret had just been revealed in the worst possible way. They faced each other across a distance that felt simultaneously too far and not nearly far enough. Steve's expression was devastated, betrayed, angry in ways that went beyond words. Around them, the celebration continued, but the space immediately surrounding them had gone quiet. Neighbors sensing drama unfolding and creating respectful distance while remaining close enough to witness. "Those are my children," Steve said, his voice flat with shock. Not a question, a statement requiring confirmation or denial. Fiona could have lied, but the truth was written in her silence, in the identical features of 3 children who stood watching their parents with confused concern. She nodded once, a small gesture that confirmed everything and destroyed whatever fragile understanding they had been building. "How old are they?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. 5, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The math was simple and damning. 5 years since the night at the hotel. 5 years of raising his children without telling him they existed. 5 years of birthdays and first words and skinned knees and bedtime stories that he had missed, that he would never get back. "You kept them from me," he said, still in that terrible flat voice that was worse than shouting. "For 5 years, you kept my children's secret. You let me search for you while knowing you were carrying triplets. You raised them alone, rather than giving me the chance to be their father." "I couldn't find you," Fiona said desperately, aware that her neighbors were listening, that her children were witnessing this confrontation. "I tried in the beginning. I had no last name, no way to reach you. The hotel wouldn't help me. I had nothing to go on. And when we reconnected," he demanded, his voice rising now with anger that had been compressed under shock. "When I was standing in that conference room telling you I had searched for you, that I wanted to understand what happened, you looked me in the eye and said nothing. You kissed me and said nothing. You let months pass while I was in the same city, available, present, and you never once thought to mention that I have 3 children." Tears streamed down Fiona's face. "I was afraid. You're wealthy and powerful, and I thought you might try to take them from me. I thought—" "You thought wrong," he interrupted, his words sharp as broken glass. "You decided I was someone who would hurt you and your children without giving me a chance to prove otherwise. You made that decision unilaterally and stole 5 years of my children's lives from me." He looked at Jasper, Laurel and Sienna, who stood together watching their mother cry, and this strange man who was shouting. Steve's expression softened slightly when he looked at them, but when his gaze returned to Fiona, the hardness returned. "I wanted to find you," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "Or I hired investigators. I went back to the hotel over and over, hoping you would appear. I told you I searched, and you knew the entire time that I had children I knew nothing about. You watched me talk about how that night changed me, and you said nothing." The accusation hung between them, loaded with 5 years of missed moments and stolen opportunities. Fiona had no defense that would satisfy him, no explanation that could justify what she had done. Fear was a reason, but not an excuse, and standing in the park, watching him look at her with eyes that now saw only betrayal, she understood the magnitude of her mistake. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate. "Sorry doesn't give me back 5 years, Steve said. He looked at the triplets again, his expression a complicated mixture of wonder and grief. Then he turned and walked away from the celebration, from the community that had adopted him during the project, from Fiona and the children whose existence he had just discovered in the worst possible way. Fiona stood frozen as neighbors gathered around her, offering comfort and asking questions she could not answer. Jasper approached her cautiously. "Mom, why was that man crying?" She pulled all 3 of her children close, hugging them with desperate strength while her world collapsed around her for the second time in her relationship with Steve Hughes. And she understood with terrible clarity that this time, the destruction was entirely her fault. Chapter 7. The Beautiful Unraveling. The legal papers arrived exactly 1 week after the revelation, delivered by a courier who handed Fiona the envelope with professional neutrality, while she stood in her doorway, feeling her legs threaten to give out beneath her. And she understood that Steve's devastation had transformed into action that would tear apart everything she had built. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope and pulled out documents that were thick and official and terrifying in their specificity. Petition for joint custody, request for equal parenting time, establishment of paternity through DNA testing. The legal language was cold and precise, outlining Steve's rights and intentions with clarity that left no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. Fiona read through the pages while tears blurred her vision, seeing her worst fears materialized in words that would be enforced by courts and legal precedent. He wanted half their time. He wanted decision-making authority over their education, medical care, religious upbringing. He wanted to be a father, and he was using the full weight of his wealth and resources to claim his rights after years of being denied them. She could not afford the attorney she needed. The initial consultation confirmed what she already suspected. Fighting Steve Hughes in family court would require financial resources she did not possess. His legal team specialized in complex custody cases, and they had made it clear through preliminary correspondence that they intended to pursue this matter aggressively until Steve received what he was entitled to as a father. The custody evaluation was the worst part. A stranger came to her home, observed her interact with the children, asked questions designed to assess her fitness as a parent. The evaluator was polite but thorough, noting the modest size of their apartment, the second-hand furniture, the financial strain evident in deferred maintenance and carefully budgeted resources. Fiona answered questions about her parenting philosophy, her support system, her work schedule. She explained how she balanced design projects with childcare, how Pearl and other neighbors created a network of assistance that allowed her to provide stable care. She described bedtime routines and favorite foods and the way she handled discipline and encouragement, but underneath every answer was the knowledge that Steve could offer things she could not. Private schools, extensive resources, a home with individual bedrooms instead of shared space. Opportunities she wanted for her children but could not provide on her modest income. The evaluator visited Steve's residence separately, and Fiona imagined what that report would contain. Spacious accommodations, financial stability beyond question, the ability to provide every material advantage children could require. The first court-ordered visitation happened on a Friday afternoon that felt like pieces of Fiona's soul were being torn away by legal mandate. Steve arrived precisely on time, his car pulling up to her building exactly as specified in the temporary order. He knocked on her door with the formal politeness of strangers, and when she opened it, they looked at each other with expressions that held pain neither knew how to navigate. Jasper, Laurel and Sienna approached him cautiously, confused by the sudden presence of a father they had only heard about in bedtime stories. Steve crouched to their level, his voice gentle as he introduced himself properly, explaining that he was their father and that he wanted to spend time with them. "Where were you before?" Jasper asked with the blunt honesty of children. His protective instincts for his mother were strong, and he eyed Steve with suspicion that was painful to witness. "I didn't know about you," Steve answered honestly. "If I had known, I would have been here from the beginning." Laurel, always seeking to bridge gaps, took Steve's hand tentatively. "Are you nice?" she asked, her voice small. Steve's face softened with emotion. "I want to be the best father I can be for you," he said. "I know this is confusing, but I hope we can get to know each other." Sienna watched silently, her wise eyes assessing this man who claimed to be their father. And Fiona could see her daughter processing information in ways that would manifest later in questions and observations. Watching them leave was agony. Fiona stood in her doorway as Steve guided 3 children toward his car, Jasper glancing back repeatedly to make sure his mother was still there, Laurel chattering nervously to fill the silence. Sienna holding Steve's hand but looking uncertain about this entire situation. The weekend stretched endlessly. Fiona cleaned her apartment obsessively, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, organizing closets that did not need organizing, doing anything to avoid sitting still with her thoughts. She cooked meals no one would eat and stared at family photos while tears streamed down her face. Pearl came over Saturday evening and sat with her in silence that was more comforting than any words could have been. "Those babies love you," Pearl said finally. "One weekend with their father isn't going to change that. What if he turns them against me?" Fiona whispered. "What if he tells them I kept him away deliberately?" "Then you tell them the truth," Pearl said firmly. "That you were scared and made a mistake because you were trying to protect them. Children understand fear. They understand imperfect love. You give them too little credit if you think they can't handle complicated truth." When Steve returned the children Sunday evening, they were exhausted and overwhelmed. His apartment was too big, too quiet, too full of new toys that felt like bribes. They had missed their mother desperately, clung to her when they came home, and asked when they would have to go back. Steve stood in her doorway looking equally devastated. Fiona saw the exhaustion in his face, the defeat in his posture. Being a father was nothing like managing anything he had experienced professionally. His children challenged him in ways that money and strategy could not solve. "They cried for you," he said quietly, his anger from the revelation replaced by something that looked like grief. "Last night, Laurel had a nightmare and cried for her mother, and I didn't know how to comfort her because I'm a stranger to them." Fiona felt no satisfaction in his struggle, only shared pain at the impossibility of their situation. "They need time," she said gently. "This is all new to them." "I wanted this," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I fought for the right to be their father, but now I'm here, and I don't know what I'm doing. And they look at me like I'm someone trying to steal them from the life they know." They stood in her doorway, having the most honest conversation they had shared since the revelation. But the legal proceedings had created a chasm too wide to bridge through sympathy alone. He left without another word, and Fiona closed her door, knowing that their situation would get worse before it had any chance of getting better. The custody arrangement settled into a painful routine. Steve exercised his court-ordered time with rigid precision, arriving exactly on schedule, returning the children exactly when specified. Their communication happened only through carefully worded texts about pickup times and schedule changes. Every interaction filtered through the legal framework that now defined their relationship. Jasper grew increasingly protective of his mother, positioning himself between her and Steve during exchanges, watching his father with wariness that never fully disappeared. Laurel tried to please both parents, adapting her behavior to fit what each expected, which broke Fiona's heart because her daughter should not have to navigate adult conflicts with such careful emotional labor. Sienna remained watchful and quiet, processing everything with that old soul wisdom that seemed impossible in someone so young. Fiona watched her children leave for weekends and felt like she was losing pieces of herself repeatedly. She had never been apart from them for extended periods, and the empty apartment echoed with their absence in ways that made her question every decision she had made from the moment she walked into the wrong hotel room. Steve, meanwhile, discovered that all his resources meant nothing. When faced with children who wanted authenticity rather than material compensation, he hired child psychologists who gave him strategies that felt clinical and wrong. He bought toys and books and games that remained largely untouched. He child-proofed his apartment and created spaces designed for children. But Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna moved through these carefully constructed environments like visitors in a museum, touching nothing without permission, never quite relaxing into the comfort he was trying to provide. When Jasper asked him why he was not there for their first 5 years, Steve struggled to answer honestly without making Fiona the villain. He did not want to poison his children against their mother, but explaining his absence without revealing that she had kept them secret felt impossible. "Your mother and I met briefly," he said carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes and circumstances become complicated. I didn't know you existed, but now that I do, I want to be the best father possible." "Do you love Mom?" Laurel asked with the direct emotional inquiry that children specialize in. Steve paused, knowing his answer mattered more than she understood. "Your mother and I have a complicated history. We're trying to figure out how to be good parents to you, which is the most important thing." It was not an answer, and they all knew it. The question of what existed or could exist between Steve and Fiona hung unaddressed in the space between custody exchanges and legal proceedings, both of them too wounded to acknowledge. The attraction that still existed despite betrayal and anger, and the formal structures that now govern their interactions. Months passed in this holding pattern of scheduled custody and careful distance, both Fiona and Steve existing in separate worlds of regret, while their children navigated between them with resilience that was heartbreaking to witness, and neither parent knew how to bridge the chasm that seemed to widen with each passing week of continued estrangement. Chapter 8. The Betrayal That Shatters Everything. Bethany Walsh entered Steve's life again with the timing of someone who had been watching from the shadows and waiting for vulnerability to create opportunity. And she was beautiful and sophisticated and absolutely toxic in ways that would nearly destroy everything before Steve finally understood what real betrayal looked like. She appeared at a charity gala. Steve attended because his presence had become expected at these events, bringing coffee to his table during the reception with a smile that suggested intimate history and comfortable familiarity. Bethany looked exactly as he remembered, polished, elegant, perfectly at ease in social situations that required performance and presentation. "I heard about your situation," she said with carefully calibrated sympathy. "Custody battles are so difficult. I wanted to reach out earlier, but thought you might need space to process everything." Steve accepted her company because isolation had become exhausting, and Bethany represented a time when his life felt simpler, before complicated women and surprise children and legal proceedings. that left everyone wounded. She listened to his struggles with apparent understanding, offering observations that seemed helpful rather than manipulative. "I can't imagine keeping that kind of secret," Bethany said over drinks after the gala. 5 years of your children's lives. It must feel like such a violation of trust." Her words validated his anger in ways that felt satisfying, and Steve found himself confiding in her about the difficulty of building relationships with children who saw him as an intruder. Bethany listened with sympathy that seemed genuine, and gradually she became a regular presence in his life again. She brought him coffee during late-night custody negotiation sessions with his attorneys. She attended events with him, standing by his side at functions with the ease of someone who belonged there. She offered advice about dealing with Fiona that always positioned his ex-fiancée's perspective as reasonable and Fiona's as manipulative. "She's using the children to maintain control over you," Bethany suggested during one conversation. "Keeping them secret all those years, and now she's making you fight for every moment with them. It's a classic power play," Steve wanted to believe. Fiona's secrecy came from calculated manipulation, rather than fear, because anger was easier to manage than the complicated grief of understanding that they had both made terrible mistakes that wounded everyone involved. Bethany fed his anger with subtle encouragement, never overtly poisoning his perspective, but consistently framing situations in ways that made Fiona appear strategic rather than scared. Society columns began featuring Steve and Bethany together, photographs of them at charity events and gallery openings, captions speculating about rekindled romance. The images made their way to Fiona through neighbors who read gossip sections and friends who thought she should know what Steve was doing. Seeing him smile at another woman, watching him escort Bethany through events with ease and affection, broke something in Fiona that the custody battle had only cracked. She told herself she had no right to feel betrayed. They were not together. Their relationship existed only through shared custody and legal communications. But the pain was overwhelming anyway, confirmation that she had imagined the depth of connection between them, that she was replaceable and easily forgotten while he moved forward with his actual life. Pearl found her crying over photographs in a magazine. "That man is making a mistake," Pearl said firmly. "That woman doesn't have his best interests at heart." "Maybe she does," Fiona said tiredly. "Maybe she's exactly what he needs. Someone from his world who understands his life." "You understand his life," Pearl countered. "You understand his heart. That's more important than understanding which fork to use at fancy dinners." But Fiona could not believe her anymore. Every photograph of Steve with Bethany felt like proof that the night they shared had been aberration rather than destiny, a moment of connection that meant more to her than it ever had to him. The devastating betrayal came during a custody hearing. Fiona sat in the courtroom with her modest attorney, facing Steve and his expensive legal team. The proceedings had become routine. Arguments about parenting time, discussions of holiday schedules, debates about decision-making authority. Then Bethany was called as a character witness. Fiona watched in horror as this woman she had never met took the stand, was sworn in, and began systematically destroying her character with testimony dressed as concern. Bethany described Fiona as emotionally unstable, citing the 5-year secret as evidence of questionable judgment. She implied that Fiona's modest financial circumstances made her unfit to provide the life these children deserved. "I'm concerned about the children's welfare," Bethany said with perfectly performed sympathy. "They should have access to opportunities their mother cannot provide. Stability, resources, educational advantages. Steve can offer them everything they need, including a stable family environment." The implication was clear. Bethany positioned herself as potential stepmother, the appropriate maternal figure for children being raised in inadequate circumstances by a woman who had already demonstrated catastrophic failure of judgment. Fiona's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing that Bethany's testimony was prejudicial and based on speculation rather than knowledge, but the damage was done. The judge listened with the carefully neutral expression of someone weighing testimony against existing evidence, and Fiona knew that wealthy, articulate character witnesses carried weight that her modest circumstances and secret-keeping could not counter. She looked at Steve, seeking some sign that he knew what was happening, some indication that he saw through Bethany's performance to the manipulation underneath. But his face was stone. He sat beside Bethany, allowing this assassination of Fiona's character to proceed without intervention, and whether he believed the accusations or simply did not care enough to stop them, the result was the same. This betrayal was different from what her former partner had done, different from the custody battle itself. This felt personal and cruel, an attack on her fitness as a mother, delivered by someone who knew nothing about her except that she stood between Steve and some idealized family structure he apparently wanted to create. The hearing ended with a ruling that awarded Steve additional parenting time. The judge, influenced by testimony about his resources and stability, determined that the children would benefit from more time in his environment. Fiona did not lose custody, but the balance had shifted, and she left the courtroom, understanding that the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. She maintained her composure until she reached her car. Then she sat in the parking structure and cried, with the kind of complete devastation that comes from being betrayed by someone you loved while they stood by, allowing it to happen. And she understood that whatever fragile hope she had maintained about someday finding their way back to each other had just been destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Chapter 9. The descent into darkness. The weeks following the custody hearing felt like drowning in slow motion, water closing over Fiona's head while she struggled to breathe. And she understood that sometimes survival is not about winning, but about enduring until the storm passes, or you learn to breathe underwater. She functioned for her children because there was no other choice. Every morning she woke early, made breakfast, helped Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna prepare for their day. She smiled when they needed her to smile, listened to their stories with attention that required enormous effort, and maintained the routines that gave their lives structure and safety. But inside, she was disintegrating. Her design work suffered as concentration became impossible. Clients who had trusted her with their projects sensed her distraction and took their work elsewhere. Bills accumulated on her kitchen counter, unopened, because facing another manifestation of how precarious her situation had become felt beyond her capacity. The community that had sustained her rallied with support that she could barely accept. Pearl brought meals and sat with her in silence when words felt impossible. Neighbors offered childcare and errands and the kind of practical assistance that keeps people afloat during crises. But their kindness could not penetrate the fog of despair that surrounded her like a suffocating blanket. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone who had been broken twice, once by professional betrayal and once by her own choices coming back to destroy everything she had built. The weight of her secret-keeping felt crushing. If she had told Steve about the children immediately when they reconnected, would they have found a different path? Could they have built something together instead of tearing each other apart through legal proceedings and testimony that made her feel like a criminal for the sin of being afraid? And Steve experienced his own reckoning. The clarity came gradually, small observations accumulating until he could no longer ignore what they revealed about Bethany's character and his own complicity in allowing her manipulation. He overheard her on the phone with her attorney discussing strategies for pursuing full custody on Steve's behalf. She spoke about removing Fiona from the children's lives entirely, creating a proper family structure with herself as stepmother. Her tone was cold and tactical, discussing his children as assets to be acquired rather than human beings with feelings and bonds that could not be severed without causing trauma. "Those children need stability," Bethany said into her phone, unaware that Steve stood in the doorway. "She's clearly not capable of providing appropriate care. With me in the picture, we can offer them everything: proper education, social connections, a real family." Steve felt ice slide through his veins. He had been allowing this woman to testify against Fiona, to paint her as unfit, to systematically dismantle the mother of his children in pursuit of some idealized vision that had nothing to do with what Jasper, Laurel and Sienna actually needed. He confronted her that evening, and Bethany did not bother denying her intentions. She admitted without shame that she saw opportunity. His children needed a stable mother figure. Fiona was obviously overwhelmed and inadequate. Bethany could provide the sophisticated, wealthy environment these children deserved. Together they could build the perfect family. "You want to erase their mother," Steve said, horror and disgust evident in his voice. "I want to give them better," Bethany corrected. "You can't possibly think that woman is equipped to raise your children. She kept them from you for 5 years. She's clearly not stable or trustworthy." "She's their mother," Steve said quietly. "She raised them alone for 5 years, giving them love and stability with resources I cannot imagine managing. She made a mistake keeping them secret, but that doesn't make her unfit. That makes her human and frightened." Bethany's expression shifted from confident to calculating. "You still have feelings for her." It was not a question. Steve looked at this woman he had almost married and saw clearly for the first time that she had never loved him, only what he represented. Wealth, status, the opportunity to build the life she wanted, using his resources and his children as building materials. "Get out," he said simply. "We're done. If you contact my attorneys again or attempt any further involvement in my custody proceedings, I will pursue legal action against you for interference." Bethany left without argument, recognizing that she had overplayed her hand, but the damage she had caused remained. Her testimony stood in court records. The judge's ruling about additional parenting time reflected her poisonous influence. And Fiona, the woman Steve had spent 5 years searching for and another year alternately loving and resenting, now looked at him with eyes that held no hope, only resignation and grief. He tried calling her, but she did not answer. He sent messages that went unreturned. The custody exchanges became even more painfully formal, Fiona handing over their children without meeting his eyes, accepting them back with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a required task rather than engaging in a relationship. Steve sat alone in his home one evening, holding a photograph of Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna that he had taken during a weekend visit. They were smiling, but the happiness did not reach their eyes. They looked tired, confused, caught between parents who communicated only through legal frameworks and careful distance. He had wanted to be a father, had fought for the right to be one, but now faced with the reality of what his actions had cost everyone involved. He understood that having legal rights to time with his children was not the same as having their hearts or healing the damage his anger and pride had helped create. Across the city, Fiona lay in bed after tucking 3 children into their rooms. Jasper had asked again why the pretty lady said mean things about Mommy in court. Laurel had cried because she missed having one home instead of 2. Sienna had simply held Fiona's hand and looked at her with eyes that understood too much for someone so young. Fiona stared at her ceiling, understanding that she had reached the bottom of something deep and dark, a place where hope felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She had lost her career to betrayal, had found love only to lose it through her own fear, and was now watching her children navigate pain that she had helped create, through choices that seemed right at the time, but revealed themselves as catastrophically wrong with hindsight's cruel clarity. She wondered if forgiveness was possible, if the chasm between her and Steve could ever be bridged, if their children would survive this war between parents who both loved them, but could not find a way to love each other enough to choose peace over pride. The questions had no answers, and as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, Fiona understood that tomorrow would arrive whether she was ready or not, demanding that she rise again and continue functioning, because that was what mothers did, even when their own hearts were broken beyond recognition. Chapter 10. The Passionate Reunion, when Love Rewrites Everything. The crisis arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, transformed into catastrophe by a phone call that made both Steve and Fiona understand that children's lives matter more than adult pride. And sometimes it takes the possibility of unbearable loss to reveal what actually matters when everything else burns away. Fiona was meeting with a client when her phone rang. The school nurse's voice was controlled but urgent. Sienna had collapsed during lunch. High fever, difficulty breathing, an ambulance was being called. Fiona dropped everything, running to her car with hands that shook so badly she could barely start the engine. Steve received his own call minutes later. He was in a meeting that immediately ceased to matter, every professional obligation evaporating in the face of his daughter's medical emergency. He arrived at the hospital within minutes of Fiona, both of them racing through the emergency room doors with matching expressions of terror that stripped away every layer of anger and resentment accumulated during months of custody battles. They saw each other across the waiting room, and without discussion or hesitation they came together. Steve's arms wrapped around Fiona, and she collapsed into him with a sob that contained all the fear and loneliness she had been carrying alone. They held each other like drowning people clinging to wreckage, their Cold War obliterated by the primal fear that unites all parents facing their child's suffering. The doctors explained that Sienna had severe pneumonia, the infection advanced enough to require hospitalization and intensive treatment. Words like oxygen levels and IV antibiotics and monitoring washed over both parents while they tried to comprehend that their daughter, who had been fine at breakfast, was now struggling to breathe. They were allowed to see her together. Sienna looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines monitoring her vital signs, oxygen tubes in her nose, her usual wise expression replaced by feverish confusion. She reached for both parents with weak hands, and they gathered close, forming a protective circle around her fragile body. Pearl arrived with Jasper and Laurel, who were terrified and confused about their sister's sudden illness. The family gathered in Sienna's hospital room, and something fundamental shifted in the space between Steve and Fiona. The barriers they had constructed began crumbling under the weight of shared fear and the recognition that their children needed them united rather than divided. They spent days living in that hospital room, taking turns sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, learning to communicate again out of necessity. The anger and betrayal that had defined their relationship began to crack, replaced by cooperation, born from loving the same person more than they resented each other. On the third night, when Sienna's fever finally broke and she fell into peaceful sleep for the first time in days, Steve and Fiona found themselves alone in the dim light of monitoring equipment. The silence between them was no longer cold, just heavy with things unsaid, with grief over time wasted, with the slow, dawning realization that they had been fighting the wrong battles. "I ended things with Bethany," Steve said quietly. "Weeks ago, actually. I should have done it before she testified, should have seen what she was doing. I'm sorry I let her hurt you. I'm sorry for a lot of things." Fiona looked at him, seeing exhaustion and regret and something else, something that looked like the man from the hotel room breaking through the armor they had both constructed. "I should have told you about them immediately when we reconnected. I was afraid, but fear doesn't justify keeping your children from you. You lost 5 years because I was too scared to trust you." "I understand why you were afraid," Steve said, his hand reaching for hers across the space between their chairs. "I came at you with money and legal threats instead of trying to understand your perspective. I was so angry about what you kept from me that I couldn't see how my reaction was proving your fears right." They talked through the night, two people finally being honest about wounds inflicted and sustained. They discussed their childhoods, their fears, their dreams for Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna. They acknowledged mistakes, apologized for choices made from pain rather than wisdom, and began the difficult work of forgiveness that neither had believed possible weeks earlier. "I never stopped loving you," Steve admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "From that first night until now, through all the anger and fighting, I've loved you. I just didn't know how to bridge the distance between us." Fiona turned to look at him, with eyes that were exhausted and hopeful and terrified. "I've loved you since that night in the hotel. No amount of anger or betrayal could kill it. I've spent the past year trying to forget you while remembering every detail of your face." Steve stood and pulled his chair closer to hers, eliminating the physical distance that had represented their emotional separation. He took both her hands in his, and this time the touch was not just comfort but conscious choice. "I want to build a real family, not through legal agreements and custody schedules, but through love and partnership. Can you forgive me enough to try?" "Can you forgive me?" Fiona asked, tears streaming down her face. "I already have," he said simply. "The moment I saw you in that waiting room, everything else stopped mattering. I forgive you and I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that we can choose each other instead of fighting." When Sienna woke the next morning, she found both parents asleep in chairs, pulled close together, their hands still interlaced. She smiled with a wisdom beyond her years and closed her eyes again, secure in the knowledge that her family was finally becoming whole. The weeks that followed were filled with difficult but necessary conversations. They attended family counseling together with Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna, learning to communicate with intention rather than defensiveness. Steve withdrew his aggressive custody petitions, and they filed new joint custody arrangements that reflected partnership rather than combat. Steve moved to a house in Fiona's neighborhood, choosing proximity and community over luxury and isolation. He volunteered at the community center, became a regular presence in the neighborhood that had become his family's home. He learned that being a father meant showing up consistently for small moments rather than providing expensive compensations for absence. Their romantic relationship rebuilt slowly, with intention and care. They dated properly this time, learning each other in daylight and normal circumstances. Steve courted Fiona with patience and creativity, bringing her coffee before community meetings, volunteering beside her at neighborhood projects, making himself part of the life she had built rather than trying to remake her life to fit his vision. Fiona allowed herself to be vulnerable again, sharing fears and dreams, trusting that this time Steve would choose to protect her heart rather than wound it. She watched him with their children and saw genuine transformation, a man learning that love was measured in presence rather than presence, that his worth as a father had nothing to do with what he could buy and everything to do with who he chose to be. Months passed in rebuilding what had been shattered. Steve proposed in their living room with Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna watching, because this commitment was not just between two people, but between a family choosing to be whole. Fiona said yes through tears, and their children piled onto them in a chaotic embrace that felt like the truest prayer any of them had ever offered. They married simply, surrounded by neighbors who had become family, in the community center where they had first fought and then reconciled. Pearl stood as Fiona's witness, her face streaming with happy tears. Jasper, Laurel, and Sienna participated in the ceremony, their presence making everything sacred. Fiona Hughes stood in the doorway watching her husband help their children with homework at the kitchen table, evening light painting everything gold, and she understood that wrong turns sometimes lead to the most beautiful destinations. Love was not the absence of pain, but the choice to heal together, the decision to forgive imperfections and build something stronger from the broken pieces of what came before. The night she entered the wrong hotel room had been the night she unknowingly walked into her future, a future that required breaking before it could become unbreakable. And she would not change a single painful step of the journey that led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this man who was always meant to be hers, even when they both had to learn the hard way that love worth having is love worth fighting for.